dust. We are. Please give it up. Please give it up for Chesney Snow, beatboxer extraordinaire. One more round of applause. Welcome everyone to Sound and Color, the future of race and design. Thank you to everyone who's here in the room, to those in the hall, to those in the overflow room. We have a sold out day and weekend. We're really pleased and honored that you've chosen to spend this time with us. My name is Tavia Nyong'o, and I'm the curator of public programs here at the Park Avenue Armory, and I am going to get out of the way in a minute, right after I welcome you on behalf of everyone who has worked so hard for over a year, actually, to make this weekend come true. We begin by acknowledging that we are gathered here today in New York City on Lenapehoking, the traditional land of the Lenape peoples. Despite a history of genocide and settler colonialism, we know that Native people thrive today, with New York City being home to the largest indigenous community in North America. We seek to be an ongoing partnership with Native artists and communities in all our public programs, including Sound and Color, I'm pleased to say, and to make tangible investments in indigenous futures. In a moment, I'm going to hand things to my Symposium co-organizer, Jane Cox, to offer her welcome and an in memoriam. And I want to thank you all for being here, and I hope you take as much time as you can this weekend to experience this historic gathering, both in terms of the conversation and also the installations. There are many installations on this floor that you've already noticed on your way in, including a virtual reality experience running all day and all tomorrow down the hall, curated by our colleagues at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival. And please, don't miss from 3 to 4 p.m. today and tomorrow the micro-commissions that have been co-curated by the Design Collective, Design Action. Those are on the second floor from 3 to 4. There will be another reminder, don't worry. And this has been a wonderful opportunity to see emerging designers in a range of fields. So without further ado, welcome to the first, but hopefully not last, Sound and Color, the future of race and design. Please welcome my co-host, co-organizer, Jane Cox.
Thank you. Does it work? It works. Thank you so much for being here. There's a little space in the front for at least a couple of people to sit on the floor, if that's acceptable. Before we get started, I think so, like over here, or yeah. I just want to take a moment to remember and acknowledge Lukeman Brown, who many of you may know, a wonderful member of our community, a Black sound artist and musician who died far too early this week. And we would all just love to take like a 30-second moment for Lukeman. And you can hear a bit more about him tomorrow at the Black Sound Artists panel. So I just want to do that. Thank you. Thanks so much. Come on in, friends.
Hi, everybody. Thank you guys so much for being here, and definitely thanks to the Park Avenue Armory for allowing this to happen. This is a very surreal event to be taking place because the very seeds of this were planted in a room upstairs when Jane Cox came to visit me. Oh, sorry, I should introduce myself. I'm Branden Jacobs-Jenkins. I'm a playwright, professor, general busybody, and definitely a theater design nerd and enthusiast. And I've been an artist in residence here at the Park Avenue Armory for much longer than I was supposed to, thanks to COVID. And I'm also now a member of the board as well. And maybe 3 years ago, I want to say, Jane came to visit me in my studio upstairs, and we just began to have an interesting conversation about something that wound up us teaching a class together, but more generally sort of what seemed to be happening in theater design. There was something we were sort of noticing, lots of interesting questions emerging. There seemed to be this sort of interesting generational turnover. And Jane is the program director for the theater program at Princeton University. There are a lot of interesting questions coming up around just sort of theater training and pedagogy, and asking ourselves if the curriculums as we understand them were meeting the questions and needs of not just the students, the emerging theater artists, but even the students among them. Right, was something did something need to be refreshed about the discourse around the way we talk about theater design? So joining me on the panel today is obviously Jane Cox, Mimi Lien, set designer, and Mikaal Sulaiman, sound designer. And I think we are all, I guess, been designated hosts. Whatever that means, but I think we're hoping to be public enough figures that if anything sparks an idea or provokes conversation in some way, definitely feel free to come approach us at any point during this weekend. I think that we're conceiving of this as like the first manifestation publicly of an ongoing conversation, and we're so thankful for the Armory for extending the offer to host this conversation. So hopefully this is not the last you'll be seeing of whatever you'll be seeing today. I'm seeing so many friendly faces in the audience, but I'm seeing mostly complete strangers, and I'm hoping that among them are people who have no idea what we're talking about. And in the spirit of that, I guess my first question for the group is very basic, which is, what is theater design, right, to you, and what is a theater designer? Maybe those will be the first two questions I'm going to pose. I'm going to throw it at you, Mikaal.
Oh, wow. I wasn't ready for that. What is the... I'm a sound designer, so I should know I should talk into the mic. What is theater design? I think theater design at its core is part of the storytelling of the given production, whether it be a script or a devised piece that didn't have a script but has some type of story, or an immersive experience, or even an installation. That design is there to be one of the several senses that we will have as an audience member to experience that story, so that we'll be able to not only experience, but also unpack the nuance of it. Because sometimes me as a sound designer, my goal is to do something that's intersectional to what the story is doing, so that it's not always in parallel, but it's all, even though the intersectional or that perpendicular sonic experience is, of course, adding to the story overall, And so there's light, there's set, there's sound, there's choreography, there's so many different aspects of design that, just for those who aren't theater design people, this isn't the full spectrum of design in theater. This is just a slice of it. That's my first volley. Who wants to take the alley-oop?
I'll try. I mean, I feel like there's so many people in this room who will, who can answer better and contribute to this, but I feel like, I don't know, if I were to boil it down to a basic, I'm a big believer in experience and experiential cues, and so I guess I would say that it's like curating and juxtaposing like visual and sensory cues that are designed to make you feel a certain way, like you walk into a room like this and you feel a certain way. Like there are a lot of visual cues in this room, let me just say. But but yeah, but like in the curating, in the juxtaposition, you're able to sort of mix and max and calibrate that experience to the nth degree, So it feels like a sort of infinite set of variables to me.
Yeah, and maybe I would just add that I think oftentimes lighting and sound is working in the space of creating the atmosphere or tone or editorializing to some extent what's important, what's not important, and creating the energetic shifts in a piece of theater. And just as host, there's still like space in the corners over here. So if you're willing to climb over people and sit on the floor, you know they won't mind, and you can.
Not to answer my own question, but I feel like one of the reasons for this convening is I feel like my sense of what a designer has shifted just kind of tremendously over the course of my career. And I would say that, if anything, I can understand. This is what you're sort of taught, I guess, when you're coming up, that a designer is really making manifest all of the things that ultimately are abstraction until they're not, right? Like designers are actually, they hold the material world of what the playwright is imagining in their laptop, and the director is just sort of like barking about, And I think that there's something very profound in that theater in some ways, I mean, yes, you can always do theater, but designers are like the ones who bring the thing into physical form in some way, or design its physical form. And I find that very undersung quality, I guess, in what happens. And I'm curious, just people up here, like, early on we were debating what this event would be. We were like, it'd be so interesting to put us in conversation with visual artists. And it was very difficult to get that traction. And I'm curious, because I actually think about, especially the folks on this stage, designers as independent artists. But then it occurred to me that maybe there's some other kind of ontological definition that the average designer has about the work that they do. So I'm curious if you think of what you do as an art practice, or if there's some sort of service component to it. I think about how like a graphic designer versus an artist are treated. The graphic designer thought of as like the commercial side of the same act of drawing or whatever, Curious if there's a response here.
Yeah, I really, so many. Yeah, I definitely think I acknowledge like the hierarchical placement of a designer versus artist. Definitely, it feels like artists are, seen at a sort of higher level, and things like decorative arts, are sort of not given the same respect as painters and sculptors and things like that. I've given a lot of thought about this, especially like coming from an architecture background. I think my definition of design certainly is that it's answering a question. I think ultimately I've come to define for myself that you're doing the same things. Like you're engaging in the same activities, you're asking the same conceptual questions, you're dealing with materials in the same way, you're making something, but I think maybe the difference for me is that the like catalyzing question might be coming from someplace else other than yourself. And as an independent artist, you are coming up with that very question, which you then proceed to answer through your own questioning and working and process. But, where does that initial question come from? For me, that's a define.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting analog too, because a lot of visual artists work on commission, right? Where they're actually building under the star sign of an institution's demands or a space's demands, and yet it's somehow, the playwright or director that calls you up with an idea doesn't get treated the same, it gets treated as a gig or something, which I think is interesting.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's actually really right. And, if I can use like the coloring book analogy, a artist, so as we were using this term, has just a blank page, but it's still an 8x11 piece of paper, whereas a designer oftentimes has the black outlines that we have to fill in with our own color, And so we're still living inside of a confine, but we can choose whatever color, gradients, or really vibrant colors, saturated colors, or more of a watercolor, so it's a little bit more desaturated, but we're still living inside of a confine that we can still be creative in. And to your point, I think, you know, as artists, because they have kind of a free, as we imagine it, because I think you're right in regards to, you know, getting commissions and stuff. So we imagine they have free range, but usually it's for a place, for an institution or whatever, at least if you want to be an artist who's eating and paying your rent. But that in some way, you know, what we do is in some way, I think, I wouldn't call it more creative, but it's a different type of part of your brain. Because most of what I do as an artist, as a sound designer, is about translating, you know? It's like I hear something from a director, or I see something from a playwright, and I'm like trying to do the fever dream version of what does your line and your text or your stage direction really mean to me, you know? And finding out how I can kind of bring my own self to it as opposed to just serving what your words are bringing, you know, because I do think, you know, sure, there's the school bell at that one moment, but maybe it's the school bell that's in the perfect key to this transitional musical moment that makes it make more sense for me as a designer versus just, let's just find a school bell, you know? So I guess that's one way that I would look at it as well, to just kind of get that coloring book idea into it, you know?
I think there's, sorry, Jane, I just something started, I was like, I think there is also the added context of like form. I mean, I guess so for like a non-text-based piece or like even a non-narrative piece, that might be a different situation. And in terms of commission, I mean, I thought very recently, I thought about this question a lot because for Lincoln Center, I created a sort of public space installation on the plaza, Lincoln Center Plaza, in front of the Met and whatnot. And they wanted to, you know, the caption, they wanted to credit me as artist, or they kind of called it a participatory installation by an artist. I think part of that was just to get around code issues, but I felt strongly that I wanted to be credited as a designer because I felt like I approached the project as a designer. Like there was a question that was posed to me, which was, how can we make the space of the Lincoln Center campus more inclusive and welcoming? And like that was it. There was no like, what form would it take? Would it be a sculpture? Would it be a, you know, a landscape? Like it could be anything. So it was quite open in terms of how to answer that question, but I really felt like I approached it through a design lens. I'm working to address this question.
I guess just to add to all those beautiful thoughts, you know, when I was trying to make a living only as a designer, which now that I have a job at Princeton, I thankfully don't have to do, I used to feel very complicated about the question that we were treated from a financial point of view as if we were a member of the creative team, but ineligible to receive creative artists grants that directors or writers might be able to get. So from that point of view, given sort of ownership, but then expected to spend as long as it took, and yet feeling also, but actually I'm in service to this thing where I'm not really dictating the terms of the process. You know, I think if I were a fine artist, the thing I would enjoy the most about that is dictating the terms of the process. So there's that piece. And then I've just thought a lot over the years of why we prioritize or lionize the skill of coming up with the big new idea or framing the narrative, when probably what we need in the world is people who are really good at, you know, taking other people's really great ideas and manifesting them in a kind of thoughtful, collaborative, inclusive way. And so for me, it's also like, can we talk about flipping the hierarchy of what we most value culturally? People who can work in groups of people and make something together in a way that sort of includes all perspectives, kind of seems like the thing we most need as a globe if we're going to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of segues into my next thought, which, you know, as a playwright, I'm often the originary artist of any kind of theater project. One of the first things you're asked is, who do you want to be your designers? And it's always an interesting conversation because I think the average theater goer probably perceives of these names as interchangeable, right? They just like skim through their program waiting for the show to start, and they just like, oh, this is an ethnic name. This is not an ethnic. I don't know what they think, but you know, there is something. I was part of one of the things I brought to you, Jane, early on is I sensed that we were in a kind of golden age of design, in the sense that it started in conversations I would have with theaters where I'm like, well, this is why this person's more right for this than this. And you were like, right, actually these designers are not just kind of catch-all. You're not like plumbers. You know, like you're actually bringing Mimi, Jane, Mikaal in because they have a skill set that hopefully speaks to the specific needs of the event you're trying to create. And then, of course, some people are, but good luck trying to book Mimi Lien. You know, but like, you know, people get booked out, people have a higher premium on them because in some ways, and that to me felt like we were talking about artists in some way. We were talking about commissioned artists who just weren't, that skill set they possessed wasn't there. And I wondered if there was any sense on this panel that maybe we have been moving through a certain kind of golden age of theater design. I feel like I was even noticing in some of the media discourse that for the first time in reviews of new plays, you were seeing designers called out and kind of almost, not stereotype, but they would be like, and this designer did their classic thing of this thing, you know, and I feel like I've never ever witnessed that until I would say the last 5 to 8 years. And this is across all the hard designs, definitely, right? And some of the hard meaning like costume, things that involve materials versus light and sound, which I think of as soft design because they're a little invisible. But is there some idea that maybe there has been some kind of bumper crop of designers or some kind of energetic shift in the fields? I mean, you guys speak from very different, you know, parts of that forest, right? And the kind of B side of this question is, you know, there has been like a tremendous amount of diversification across the theater. Has it been enough? That's a different symposium. But, you know, I would say that I've witnessed the rise of an incredible class of designers who are much more diverse than the generation before them. And I suspect that these two things might be hand in hand. And I wonder if that's a thing that anyone has a response to.
I feel totally clear that those two things go hand in hand, I think, and a lot of that is, some of that is about asking different questions of the materials that have been presented and of when it's in an educational setting, of the way design is taught, like asking new questions, bringing new perspectives, has created, and a plethora of design programs for better or worse, because it's not necessarily work in the theater for all those people. There's work everywhere else for those people. The plethora of programs, and now there's this huge crop of wonderful designers of all cultural and racial backgrounds who have a sort of expectation of participating in the conversation at the highest level. And I see that has changed over the last 30 years. And they're ready to have conversations at the highest level about social, political, artistic content. And it just feels very different to the landscape that I came into 30 years ago.
No, it's like the way you looked at me. I was like, oh, right. I'll pick up the baton. Yeah, no, I also think, you know, a big part of it is because of the work that you and others like you, Branden, are doing as playwrights, as storytellers, bringing really incredible work to the forefront that producers find irresistible. And you as a creator and the directors that you try to bring into the fold, I'm being serious. Not too serious, but serious enough.
Everyone's
you know?
just staring at me.
Yeah.
Okay.
But that, you know, and then you bring, you know, great directors into the fold. You know, some of them here. You know, Liliana, I know you're somewhere, maybe not. But you know, that then they bring designers into the fold, and that then, you know, creates a domino effect. You know, one of my quote unquote breakout projects, or projects that a lot of people know me for, is something I did with you, Fairview, that was Jackie Sibley Jury's show that had a very specific director who had a very specific vision, who wanted very specific designers, and that was a way for other people to know my work, but it was really because the play was impactful for people, you know? And you can have plays that have a kind of diversity, but if it's not, as Michael R. Jackson was talking about recently, a type of excellence to it, right? That then it's not gonna have the kind of mass appeal, you know? And so, you know, I do think that that's one part of it, and I just wanna give you your flowers now. The other part of it, I do think also is because of the technology is now more accessible, you know? There's something to the fact that you can just use GarageBand now to just make sound cues, whereas before you needed Pro Tools, you needed a fancy studio, you needed all these other things. It's like I can pull out my iPhone, do a field recording of something, chop it up, slop it up in GarageBand, and then have a really unique soundscape that I can then put in a QLab, which is also a new technology, relatively new technology, that I can then be part of the conversation with other designers who maybe had not a monopoly, but that they had access that I didn't have access to. And so I think it's actually like many different things that are adding to the stew of why, you know, there's a lot more diversity and different perspectives, you know, across many different points of view, you know, yeah.
Yeah, I always feel like I'm the least qualified person to talk about theater history or any sort of like history of theater design, because I came to it very late and didn't have an undergraduate education where you learn a lot of those things. But I do feel like when I did arrive at theater design, there was like the presence of a sort of canon or like the legacy of, you know, American set designers, you know, like that. I always felt like there was this kind of trove or like file cabinet of like, you know, like a well-known American designer that whose work I should know and I should know, you know, and I just never knew. I never learned it, and then I didn't then have the time to go back. I was like just kind of thrown into it, and I just started doing it. So I do feel like going back to your question of your response of asking different questions, and maybe not having been steeped in this history. I think there's value. I mean, I often think that my kind of ignorance about theater history is like, in some ways, serves me because I don't have to be sort of bogged down by, oh, how did people do things before? Because, you know, ultimately, anything can be a theater design, like anything. So I feel like just being, you know, sort of being able to be open to whatever the material is and then have a response to it that feels honest is, like, I feel like that is what has perhaps fostered. But I definitely have noticed, you know, I think what you're talking about. There definitely feels like there's been a shift. So certainly in terms of materiality, I'm really interested in, like, you know, for me it seems like there's a period of set design that is sort of illusionistic, and it sort of moved into a more three-dimensional architectural space, I think, around the time when I started doing it.
Yeah, I mean, you trigger, you know, so back to our original conversation in Company K, you know, I think we began talking because we were eventually going to teach a class together during COVID on basically race and light.
We didn't know there was going to be COVID at the time.
We didn't know it was going to be COVID at the time, but it was interesting because I believe you'd come to me and said, I confessed to you that I was obsessed with designers, and we talked about a lot of stuff, but you said to me that you were noticing among your undergraduates that, like, there was this exponential increase of students who were interested in classes on theater design, and there was a struggle within the curriculum as it was built to sort of support these students, right? Usually design classes are conceived of as like a one-off nerd elective, you know, for the tech theater kids, but suddenly there was something kind of sexy happening, and I think you were about to design, you were basically trying to figure out how to design a classroom for a theater student, right, who wants to learn or explore design, right? And one of the things you brought up, which really blew my mind and kind of tapped into things I was still thinking about, is we were talking about the essential racism of LED lighting.
Oh, yeah.
That it was, and that this was becoming normalized as the primary technology, and yet it was keyed to skin tones that made it impossible to flatter darker complexions. I don't know, maybe you can unpack a little bit of what I just dumped on you, but, you know, This is a part of the, like, initial stew of, like, wait, what, you know, that brought us here today.
Well, just to tackle the first piece a tiny bit, just to say, our students, some of them are here, thanks for coming, they have come up with screens in their hands, and they have a visual and design literacy with music and environment and light and what they're wearing that, those of us over 25, over 30, don't have. They've spent a huge portion of their teens wondering, like, how should I look in this light? How do I want to present myself? So there's a kind of education in design happening there, even if it's kind of solipsistic, but it's a starting place that the previous generation of students really didn't have. So I'm amazed by how visually and musically literate the current crop is compared to even 5 years ago. So there's that piece of it. But this question of racism in technology is something that really interests me. But I'll back up a tiny bit and say, when I started teaching myself to a room with many different skin tones, and I was teaching what I had learned, which is you learn about color by lighting a pale object in a dark space. And kind of the first time I did that in a room full of students who were not all pale objects in a dark space, I was like, well, this doesn't make any sense. So the next time I taught it with we're talking about like a big piece of styrofoam here, but I taught it with different pieces, several globes of styrofoam with different colors, and was like, how do we talk about color from this perspective, and how do the background, does it have to be a dark background? All of that stuff about figure and background, it really got me to thinking about what was built in to our design education, whether you're getting that in a classroom or whether you're getting that, as a mentee of or apprentice of some wonderful designer. And how are those assumptions and the ways that theater lighting anyway has been taught through a sort of string of famous European painters who are not only dealing mostly with pale objects in dark spaces, but also dealing with, like, how do you direct attention in a way that is culturally specific and carries over to filmmaking and TV, and how do we start thinking about that in a broader way? And how does technology connect to that? Because lighting is so much about technology. And I actually ended up digging into that through computer previs programs, because my husband is a 3D designer. He builds stuff inside the computer. And I wanted him to help me build a series of images that we could use to teach, like, when we didn't have the person or the lab, what does a light look on the side of the face? What does it look? And we wanted to do a sort of multiracial cast, and very quickly discovered that to find and render people of a variety of darker skin tones was much more difficult to do well. And the reason for that is in the algorithms that are built in to the render engines. See you nodding. Yes, you know all about that. And so, much smarter people who know much more about this will talk about this stuff over the weekend. But that made me think about LED color in light and the experience I had when I lit Color Purple of trying to make Jennifer Hudson look amazing with these LED light sources. And if anyone looks amazing, it's Jennifer Hudson. And yet with these light sources, I was struggling to make Jennifer Hudson look amazing. And so there was something in the choice of LED lights that were in that mix that was not working for a particular spectrum of skin tones. I don't know if I went beyond the question, but anyway, these are some of the questions I started to ask myself.
Yeah, and I think that, as a theater artist, I think about the form as something that is essentially obsessed with mimesis, right? That the purpose of the form is to represent reality, have the potential to represent reality, and yet there's this interesting idea that the technology that we rely on gets in the way of that, right? It sort of doesn't give equity to representation in some way, and I think that's, maybe too philosophical, but that's something I think about, all the time as I think about the evolution of what the theater is trying to be, And I have a question for you, Mikaal, which is, I'm going to go to Mimi. I was trying to play out the fact that my phone is in my pocket. I need to read something from it, but I'm just going to lean in because this is an informal conversation, not a TED Talk. So Mimi, There was a Times article that came out about sort of a peg to this event, but you had a quote that I know echoes of this from conversations we've all had amongst ourselves. So I'm going to read your quote to you. I'm sorry. But I think I want to just sort of have you expand on it because I think it makes a really important point. It also sets the tone for what really is the undergirding of this event in some way. So you say designers for live performance create and curate an experience, right, by juxtaposing visual, sonic, tactile, spatial elements within a time-based structure. All of these chosen elements carry so much cultural meaning and emotion. The job of designers is to handpick those elements and create a design vocabulary that communicates narrative or a particular emotion. With that comes so much responsibility because our landscape is constructed with the goal of telling a particular story or reaching a particular audience with really calibrated visual and sensory cues. There's a lot of representation, a lot of talk about representation right now, but for me, the real interest of this symposium is the aesthetic question. Like, why do people have certain associations with certain colors and with darkness versus light? That is a huge cultural, media, anthropological question. And I'm really interested in how these two things intersect. What is the intersection between representation and aesthetics? I wonder if there's anything you wanted to add. I mean, you kind of said it. You said the thing.
Yeah, no,
but,
I mean, but as Jane was talking about that, I mean, basically, when the two of you came to me and told me about the class that you were teaching at Princeton and all of these conversations that came up in the class, a lot of which were the things that Jane just outlined, I was just like, yes. I mean, on the one hand, it starts to get really technical, which I appreciate because I feel like as designers, we traffic in both the conceptual and the practical, technical, material realms, and like to try to integrate those two things is you know, that's like how do you bring the idea to the thing, and then in the making of the thing and in the manifestation of the thing, like so much happens, and so like the LED lighting source is a great example of that. Like, yeah, you're just trying to make a light, but then in the making of that light, things get lost, or you know, priorities are embedded and built in. But yeah, like literally like your example of like in light labs across the country, you light the light-colored object mannequin in a dark space. And I literally was like, yeah, like the black box, like literally like entrenched in theater visual language is that if you paint it black, it will disappear, you know? And so like that, I was like, that is the question that I'm interested in talking about. And like, you know, the visual cues that maybe, you know, of course there's like a million ways to communicate mystery or evil or, you know, but certainly making things dark is a go-to way to communicate that because it is a kind of an entrenched language or vocabulary or like a visual lexicon within our like kind of mass media culture. So it just like, for me, it just started snowballing in my head. Like it's a huge question. So I guess that's what I meant when I was talking about the aesthetic question. Like literally like, you know, how do we feel when you look at, you know, a darkly lit space versus a brightly lit space? And what are designers trying to communicate, and what are audiences receiving, and what's the expectation, I guess, through communicating in that way.
Right, and you know, racism or racial regimes are built on visual systems.
Yes.
Right, so there are things that we take for granted or operate within us in an insidious kind of passive way, but our job is constantly to manipulate the visual, right? I think I could point to some very famous musicals currently running on Broadway who you can sort of build a moral code based on how light the actors get to how dark they get. And that's interesting that that's still happening, right, and winning all the awards. But that said, because, you know, our symposium is kind of cheekily called Sound and Color. And we're so sorry, but you know, part of I think was interesting in the conversations is that sound kind of historically lives as the invisible, right? It's the only one of the kind of four major kind of avenues of design that actually doesn't use color, right, in a literal sense. And I'm curious at the same time, I think of sound as the most kind of contested, written about, researched kind of space of racial reckoning historically, and is often the space where these issues seep in somehow. Like I think about almost the trope now of like playing loud rap music, at the beginning as a pre-show to signify something, right? And I'm just curious for you, do you perceive in your kind of part of the forest any ways in which this question puts pressure on the making that you do, right? Or the craft that you share with your colleagues?
What's the question?
Well, just these ideas of kind of how representation becomes an aesthetic question, right?
Absolutely. And it's funny because you were talking about racial regimes, and it made me think about propaganda and how important it is that we as art, or let me just speak for myself, it's important for me as an artist to kind of know that I'm propagating some type of understanding of things. So there's a cliche that you just cited, which I think, it might have been very special and new at a certain time period that might not feel as new now, but still there's probably some kind of propaganda that the director, the sound designer was probably pursuing with that, And I know, we talked about on our last call, we had a Zoom recently talking about this very event, how important it is to have representation in different projects and how thin the line can be between asking someone to be part of your project to bring their cultural identity to the project, or asking someone to bring themselves to the project, which might not be culturally cliche. So if I'm doing August Wilson, which hopefully most of you know who August Wilson is, a seminal Black playwright, do I need to bring blues music to that August Wilson play? Do I need to bring jazz? Do I need to bring hip hop to that play, Or can I bring something different? And what came to mind was how Barry Jenkins was so brilliant with Moonlight, but also even with Beale Street, but specifically Moonlight. He could have used a totally different kind of score with that, but he has Nicholas Britell, who's a violinist who also does the soundtrack or the score for Secession, but that it was so kind of epic, but it was because that's what, Barry was, I think, going for. I don't know what Barry was thinking, but I'm guessing that Moonlight wanted to feel vast in scale about this young Black boy who became this Black man. And I just wonder a lot about representation and what am I being asked when I'm being called into a space, And can I bring any version of Mikaal? Because I'm from a small suburb in upstate New York, I'm Muslim, like I'm a big guy, like there's all these different things. It's not just like, oh, I need to just bring this one aesthetic, And so I think a lot about propaganda in design and how we can now have a show that's all Black characters, but that the musical or sonic space might not feel, typically or cliche Black with big quotes around it, but it is Black because it's all Black folks, And so how can we change the narrative in that way, and how can we propagate a new narrative?
Yeah, and that's so interesting, this notion of a Black sound, but kind of pitted against this word you use, vastness. Like I can't go to that for vastness, right?
I mean, but it's funny.
Interesting.
But it's interesting, but it's also true in the sense that what are our cliches in our minds? And this goes to what you're saying with like, we are all programmed, whether we like it or not, we're all programmed based off of the films we see and the things that we have in our lexicon, both artistic, creative, and just interpersonally. But I do think there is a vastness, and that's that Mahalia Jackson thing, right? Like that's that, but it's like, but then it denotes something else. And it's like, it's always a stew when you're creating something, because you might get a little bit of that vastness from Mahalia, not to say she's the only person who represents vastness in the Black community, but then you have all these other cultural things that are on top of it. And, I was, making a note to you about one of the last shows that I worked on around that gospel song at the end of the play. And like that it just has so much other things that comes along with it that you might want only a piece of it, but that's where, design comes in, and that's where you kind of have to pick and choose and know what you're doing. But I didn't mean to cut you off. It sounded like you were going to go.
No, not at all. I'm just excited to be up here talking to you.
Same.
So what we've decided is, rather than a proper Q&A, we would open because we don't really have answers. In the spirit of this beginning, we would pass around a mic and maybe see if there were just questions anyone wanted to speak into the room at the beginning of this weekend or just in general. Is there a microphone going around? I'm not sure if people just going to use their...
I'm sure we could probably hear you if you speak,
yeah,
but we'll repeat the question.
Room. So I see a hand in the background by the door. Yes. Okay.
Jane, you brought up the idea of collaboration.
Yeah, psych.
Are there tools that you use to promote collaboration, over appropriation? And what do you think still needs to be done in order to help guide us in that direction? Did you guys get it all? Sorry.
Yeah, we're just not going to answer right. That was the deal we made. Okay, but we'll see you in the, there's going to be lots of pockets of this evening or this week to have informal conversations. Again, we're approachable. We're offering to be approached, so please do that. Any more questions for the room? We've got one in the front here.
Yeah, my question is, what are some actionable examples that academic institutions, thank you, can do to support a healthy environment for diversity that extends beyond community agreements?
Got two questions here. We've got someone sitting on the floor. Hi.
But an observation, I'm an art historian, and so one of the things I'm struck by with the challenge of thinking about like the value judgments of light and dark is that there's these hundreds and thousands of years of readings, and so when you're teaching in an educational environment, there's also this push-pull between how we want to recode and rethink some of what we've been given, and also these tools that we teach students of what the expected reading is, and just to think about how long that legacy is and how much we're both as teachers showing what that history is and then inviting a recoding and thinking about that. And so just that there's both sides, both the creation and the reading.
I'll go behind you. Yeah. Got you.
I'm always silent at these things, so I'm just going to ask. First, I want to thank you all because as a Muslim, Catholic, Iranian, Guatemalan, Mayan artist, I've been trying to talk about non-binary since I'm 1971. And so first thank you because I don't know if I'm going to see you all again. But my question comes in, how do we change this dichotomy? I know as a playwright performer, I get paid $100, $200, union, whatever. When I started telling people I was a visual artist, I got commissions of $20, $30, $40, $50,000. If I say I'm an experienced designer building a lowrider for a museum, all of a sudden, bam, things change for me. If I say I come in as a playwright or director or a performer, the question changes there again. The hybrid way of making has been my way of life, but it's still not respected everywhere. And as you all were describing it today, I wanted to thank you, but that's the question running through my head. How do we change this dichotomy? I'm a professor in Arizona. I think in 10 years we can have this conversation. So how are we gonna have this conversation after today? That's what I'm asking today.
What was your name?
Robert Farid Karimi. We can talk later. Assalamu alaikum.
Yeah, well, look at my son, bro. Inshallah.
Questions in the front here?
Yeah. Hi, Alex. Branden, you had said something that kind of caught my interest. You had said that we're in a bit of a golden age of designers. My counter to you is there any way in which you can have a golden age of anything without proper representation of people of color fueling it? Because I would argue, as somebody who's been working in New York, as a senior designer for the past year, that as a person of color scenic designer, I am not properly represented by scenic designers at the highest level of which we do this. And so when you said that we were in a golden age of designers, that struck me a certain way, because I would feel that we're heading into one if we can continue to get people who look like me to do the things that we do. But we're not there now because there's not enough people who look like me doing what I do. And that's a shame. And we need to keep working on how we do that. So I guess that was just my counter to you is how can we be in a golden age without black people, without, people of color in general?
I don't get to answer that.
I know, right?
But I have so many answers. We gotta stick to the rules. But yes. Last question.
Okay, hi. I guess this panel has brought up the question of, as a design student, designers are really taught that there is like an assembly line of how theater's made, and that there's like certain places where design goes. And I guess I just wonder how like a relationship between like a writer and a designer, like that's kind of a perverse relationship. We're not taught to like have a relationship like that. And like how breaking down that assembly line can create more equitable storytelling or more like progressive forms of storytelling in the future, because so much of what we do is taught to be in response to this like generative literary impulse rather than like a part of that. And I don't really know what that means, but it's an open question. I think I think like we're really taught that there's a text, whatever that is, and like whatever form that takes, and then there's a director that interacts with that text, and then we interact with the director. And I think that's broadened, and there's so many caveats coming to mind, but that's what we're taught, I think.
Yeah. First of all, I love that we already got inter-participant conversations going on. It's working, guys. Before we all head out, I'm curious to hear each of you. I mean, this event is very multi-directional and multi-dimensional. There's things happening on top of things. And I'm curious if you each have something you're particularly excited about, even if it's an event or an encounter that's happening this weekend that you'd want to share with the group. Maybe start with you, Jane.
I'm super excited about the emerging designers commissioned through Design Action who are on the second floor. And between 3 and 4, you'll be able to see what they're doing. And it seems so important to have that element of sort of design in action. They were given 2 days to make a thing on a prompt, and they very bravely have done it. And it just shows you like how many different ways you might go the same prompt. So make sure to see that.
I think because for me, as I said before, like the catalyst for me, the conversation was the conversation about light and race, and so I'm very interested in that because I feel like that gets at the heart of the aesthetic question that I'm really, really curious about. I just also wanted to sort of just say, like, I was just struck by a couple of things that were brought up in the conversation, and I feel like it just leads me to want to say that I agree with you, Jane, that like I don't think what we need is more people having the big idea, because there's so much work to be done in terms of the recoding of how visual language is disseminated. And so I'm really interested in like elevating the status of the designer as someone like Branden, you asked on a call, like, can design bring about liberation? And I'm like, yes, and I think that work needs to be done.
Yeah, snap to that. Yeah, I was saying this backstage, if we can call it backstage, how this is so rare that designers get the chance to be together and just talk to each other and build when it's not a technical design, conference or something like that, or it's not purely around education where it's some educational conference, but that this is a space for designers to talk about design and creativity. And it's just shocking that this is the first time I've ever been to something like this. So thank you, Jane. Thank you, Branden, for bringing this about. And I'm looking forward to just talking to people. You first.
Yes. And I'll say, I don't have a one select, but I'll say, not answering your question, but a golden age is a retrospective term, right? By definition, a golden age is a thing that you've passed through. And I think we're entering a new moment in design, which anyone working in theater knows, which has this word austerity is showing up. And I'm curious about how that weaves its way in and out of conversations this whole weekend as people talk about what they just came from. But we think about how there's going to be an incredible shift in terms of how theater interacts with materiality for at least the near future. So that's a cheat, but I get to do that. All right, so listen, this is over. But this is just the first act of what I hope will be a really substantive and amazing group of conversations and panels and artists and interactions amongst you. It'd be interesting if we could foment liberation this weekend. It'd be great if we could trace it back historically to this weekend. And I'm also very excited for the panel that's coming up where Liliana Bain-Cruz and her long-term designers are going to talk through, I guess, the experience of what it is to work again and again and again together. That's going to be interesting. But thank you guys, and thank you, Park Avenue Armory.